Hello, my name is Megan Corcoran and I co-chair the Gaming Provider-led Business Steering Group, set up to design, implement and embed the processes industry requires for business switching. For the purpose of the presentation, mobile is out of scope, but geographic and non-geographic numbering is in scope. In April 2023, Ofcom changed the general conditions, and switching is now defined as where an end customer wishes to change their voice or broadband service from one communication provider to another at the same location. This means that residential and business customers of all sizes must be able to switch their voice or broadband service to a new provider using a process led by the new gaining provider. This is regardless of network or technology. OTS, or switching for residential customers, will go live on the 12th of September 2024. Business customers will then follow, but we don't have a defined date as yet. The FCS website houses a plethora of documentation on behalf of the Gaming Provider-led Business Steering Group. A detailed process and all the supporting documentation can be found on the link on the slide. This is the first webinar and it's a high-level overview, and there will be more to follow. I'll now hand over to Laura Meakin and Dave Stubbs, who will take you through the high-level regulation and process design. Thank you.
And welcome to the Gaming Provider-led Business Switching Steering Group Industry Engagement Session number 1. Thank you for watching our first recording on the Gaming Provider-led Business Switching process. The Gaming Provider-led Business Steering Group is made up of a range of communication providers serving business end users, including wholesalers, aggregators, network resellers, trade associations, and direct CPs who've spent thousands of hours working on a process to work for the whole of the business market. We were set up to design, implement, and embed industry processes to support complex and simple business switching of fixed voice and broadband services. We have and continue to engage Ofcom on both the principles and our approach. This session is focused on CPs providing business of voice services excluding mobile and/or internet access services to end users irrespective of the network. Through this session, industry leads from the Gaming Provider-led Business Steering Group will give you an introduction to the Ofcom switching regulations. We'll share with you some of the industry process principles. We'll update you on the proposed process at a high level, which will support retail providers to meet their switching obligations, both as a gaining CP and as a losing retail CP. We'll also explain to you how you can give feedback or get involved with the new process. From April 3rd, 2023, Ofcom introduced changes to the general conditions. Consumer and business customers of all sizes are able to switch certain services to a new provider using a process led by their new gaming provider, and that's regardless of the network or the technology that their existing provider uses. The switching rules apply whether the service is an internet access service or a voice number-based interpersonal communication service, excluding mobile. The regulation introduced a single industry switching process for consumers, called One Touch Switch, and for business switching, Ofcom required the industry create and operate a switching process that is gaining provider-led. Gaining provider-led means that the gaining provider leads that switching process, but they do need to work with a losing provider to coordinate and complete any switch. This includes where a customer wishes to switch retail providers or networks. Switching dates. Under the new rules, switching dates should be as soon as possible or customer driven. Note, some network operators are moving from fixed lead times to reduced lead times within their order journeys. For example, under the notification of transfer process, a 10-day lead time existed. These will reduce to new minimum lead times. Compensation. There are new rules relating to business switching within the general conditions. These are linked to delays and failure to comply with General Conditions C7. Express consent. The gaming provider must ensure that the customer has expressly agreed to the switching of their business voice and/or broadband services. Communication changes. Both the gaining and the losing provider will need to keep the customer informed throughout the business switching process. The losing provider must not attempt to frustrate the switching process. And finally, the concept of cancel other, where the current losing provider may reject a switch for legitimate reasons, that will be removed as part of the new Ofcom general conditions and will be reflected in some network operator business switching journeys. Cancel own will remain. In order to provide a business switching process that meets the Ofcom regulatory requirements, we need to define a process to enable communication between the gaining and losing providers to support both simple and complex business switches. One-touch switching supports residential switching. Our industry gaining provider-led business steering group came together to define a workable process to support pan-industry business switching requirements. Before we walk you through the high-level end-to-end business switching process, we thought it'd be helpful to share with you some key principles which underpin the new switching journey. The new regulations and associated accountabilities are focused on the retail CP, that is, the provider with a contractual relationship with the customer. The process focuses on both the losing and the gaining retail CP's responsibilities and is agnostic of the supporting supply chain. All current supply chain activities will still need to be completed and are not incorporated into the switching process. The concept of retail communication providers and a retail CPID are being introduced for business switching. This will mean that each retail provider will need to register each of their brands, that's the name on the bill, with a switching hub which will be supplied by TOTSCO and other managed access providers. This will allow a gaining provider to readily identify the losing provider when talking to a customer. Retail CPs must be able to support a losing journey, even if they decide that they no longer want to switch a new customer to them. Retail CPs must keep their customers informed throughout the switching process, and in order to support this, we recommend that the impacts of switching are clearly communicated to the customer. Larger business customers may not have the full details of all of the services that they want to switch. The process introduces the availability of an asset list request, which would be sent from the losing provider to the customer directly. This information will help to ensure that the correct services are switched. This is intended to be requested only when necessary and shouldn't be needed for simple switching scenarios. This process provides a mechanism to enable retail CPs to be compliant. However, each provider will still need to complete their activities that exist both within and outside of the process to be compliant. Many business CPs, some larger and most smaller CPs, will not wish to develop their own interface and will choose to access a switching hub using a managed access provider. The new process accommodates the full range and complexity of switching scenarios that exist within the business market. As a final note, you will appreciate that we're not a regulator or an enforcement body. This process was developed after many hours of expert industry input. Today, this is the only pan-industry process for voice and broadband business switching that we're aware of. Dave Stubbs will now go through the high-level process and talk through some of the key principles.
Hello, this is a walkthrough of the GPLB business switching process. The basic premise for business switching is to try and keep it as close in implementation to the one-touch switch process as possible to make it easier for those that have already implemented One Touch Switch to enhance their existing solutions to support business switching. And also, because a lot of information already exists in supporting the One Touch Switch process, that will bring benefits to the business community in implementing their own solutions. What this means in practice is the messaging protocols are still the same, and the messaging formats are based on those used by One Touch Switch as well, with a few enhancements. Here you can see in black the same messages are used for business switching as used for residential. The red are the new message formats implemented for GPL switching for business, and those we'll cover in a bit more detail as we go through this demonstration. Business messages are different to the residential messages. There are more parameters and they have a different name, but ultimately they are built on the same principles with the same core content. Business switching differs from residential in that instead of having to get a match of all services and the customer in the first matching step, the important piece is to actually identify the customer successfully. Services can still be supplied on a match request, but if they are rejected, that doesn't stop a switch order being issued as long as the customer has been successfully identified. How much information needs to be supplied to get to match will very much depend on the size of the customer, the nature of the sites that they're switching, and whether all the services can be clearly identified by identifiers, or if they are not identified, then the sites to which they relate to. The matching journey can be as simple for a SOHO-style business as it is for a residential customer, following a match, order, and switch simple message flow. But in more complex business scenarios, multiple sites, multiple services, switched over time, parallel running, the message protocols will support those. Let's look at a real customer example. Here we have a customer who's got several sites, only one account, and only one service provider. Business switching will support much more complex scenarios, but let's keep it simple for now. Our customer decides they want to contact Orange Telecom because they're switching from Purple Telecom. They initiate the conversation in the sales channel and they take the order in the normal way. The gaining provider is going to ask the customer if they'd like to manage the switch on their behalf from their current provider, and our customer accepts. Now the gaining provider needs some details. They ask the customer for the company that they're switching from, Purple Telecom in this instance, a service address that will be identifiable against that account, anyone that they're providing new service to will do, an identifier that's going to clearly identify that customer to that existing provider, like an account number, a private service identifier, not a public one, anything like that will do. If the customer doesn't know everything, that's okay at this point. We're just trying to get a match and identify the customer. Let's assume they know it all for a moment. Our new provider takes the order from the customer and in the background sends off a match request to Purple Telecoms. Now this process can take a little time. Unlike One Touch Switch for residential, businesses aren't always automated and fully online, but there is an expectation of being able to get a response from your current provider within 24 hours for relatively simple requests, and it may take a little longer if you've got more complicated matching to do. For example, hundreds of services and lots of sites. There may well be providers that can turn a response around in minutes if they're fully automated, but the process has to allow for those that aren't. So your mileage may vary depending on who your customer is switching from. Our losing provider receives that request to do the switch, checks their records, identifies the customer, and having confirmed their identity through account numbers or from a private identifier held against their records, is happy to respond and provides a switch order reference, or SOR as we know them, that allows the gaining provider to proceed with switching activities. If services were also supplied on the match request, they're checked by the provider as well And if they match, a successful response will be returned, but any that don't match can be indicated it's still a successful match request because we still identified the customer. Only those services that didn't match will be flagged for the customer to do some other checking with. At this point, I'd like to talk about asset lists. Customers don't always know the services that they have, or at least they can't provide identifiers for the losing provider to match them. More often than not, this would be broadband service related, but could also be for telephone numbers where they don't know the full extent of the ranges they own. In this situation, the match request provides the facility for the gaining provider to request an asset list to be provided by the losing provider to the customer. The losing provider has an obligation, given the information supplied in the match request, to supply that customer with a list of all of the services they provide within the scope of the request, and for each one, clearly provide an identifier that they would be able to match and respond against on a subsequent match request. These asset lists are sent directly to the customer and not to the gaining provider, as exposure of a customer's assets would be a breach of privacy. Let's see what that looks like. Here, the losing provider has created a list of all of their assets and sent them to the customer via email or via post to a contact identified on a match request. With the asset list in hand, the customer can now contact their gaining provider again to raise an appropriate match to add the extra services to their request. Because the losing provider had already issued a switch order reference, the gaining provider can just simply raise a service request for the additional services that the customer wishes. This keeps the process simple by not having to go through elongated switch matching again, and just focuses on what's necessary at each step. So let's recap for a moment. Our customer, through their new provider, has been identified by their losing provider on a match request. They've identified all of their services and have been issued a switch order reference for all the remaining transactions to be processed. No orders have yet been placed, so there's no obligation for the customer to switch and no direct action for the losing provider to take at this stage. They've clearly been identified by the losing provider. The gaining provider knows that they can deliver service and switch for them. Let's see what happens next when the customer is ready to proceed. When the gaining provider is ready to proceed with their order, they will send an order request to the losing provider to indicate which services are going to be switched and when. The losing provider acknowledges that request, validates the services from the switch, making sure that those being requested to switch have actually been matched previously. No new services can be added at this stage without first going through an additional match step. The losing provider may use the information in this match order to start processes in terms of understanding what to do with the losing service for that customer, generating communications to keep them informed of any processes or costs involved, and also they may begin to start the process with their wholesale supply chain if that's necessary. It's important for the gaining provider, if dates changed, to keep the losing provider informed of that so that they can change those customer services and make sure that they don't get disconnected unexpectedly. The same is true if the customer cancels their order and wishes to retain service with the existing provider. When the gaining provider has finished supplying services and the customer is satisfied and ready to have their services switched off, they will instruct the gaining provider to inform the losing provider. Depending on the type of order and how many services there are, this may be automatic at the point of provisioning your new services. In other situations where the customers prefer dual running to test their services before switching off their existing lines, the customer would give that instruction to their new provider. At the point of disconnection, the new provider will contact the losing provider with a trigger request, a switch. This clearly indicates which services to switch at this time. Not all services have to be switched if the customer isn't ready to, and they can leave some services for later if they're still testing. the losing provider acknowledges the switch request and is required to cease billing where appropriate immediately at that point. The gaining provider may specify a date by which their services were provided and the switch was requested if making that request was slightly delayed, in which case the losing provider should backdate their billing to that date. The losing provider does not necessarily have to disconnect all the services at that point in time. They just have to ensure they are no longer billing the customer for them. In the event of a switch of voice services, number porting would have followed the number porting processes to remove the telephone numbers and switch them to the new provider alongside the switching process. It may be that there are other services still being supplied by the losing supplier to the customer, and the customer would have to contact them directly, in which case to cancel those. Once all services are switched for a customer, the remaining services, if any, that no longer wish to be switched, would be cancelled by the gaining provider, and the transaction would be concluded. So in summary, we match and identify our customers first. We identify their services, and where necessary obtain an asset list if we need to do so to get accurate information. Once a customer is ready to proceed with their switch, the gaining provider would initiate that, and they keep the losing provider informed of any changes of dates or cancellations if the customer is no longer wishing to switch. And finally, when their new provider has delivered their services, they inform the losing provider to cease their services and to stop billing. Now let's talk about some more complicated switches and what that means. Customers may well be switching services from multiple vendors, in which case the processes in this presentation would be followed for each losing provider, and the gaining provider would have a switch order reference related to each of those provider journeys. More complex switches are accommodated by allowing multiple sites to be provided on different match requests or by specifying different account numbers. Multiple match requests could be sent referencing an existing switch order reference, so you build up a complex profile of a customer and their services without having to have hundreds of different switch order references. And each service or site or account could be progressed at whatever pace the customer wishes to proceed. Not all services have to be requested on an order at the same time, or switched at the same time, or updated at the same time. The messages facilitate both scenarios. Now, a word on customer protection. It's recognised that in a more complex environment of business switching, that the chances things go wrong exists. In those situations, we've provided a notification message within the framework. Its intent is for the losing provider to be able to inform the gaining provider when a situation arises that they should be aware of. For example, unintentional or malicious switching. It's expected that the gaining provider should communicate with the losing provider with the information supplied in the notification to resolve the issue before proceeding with the switch, if at all.
There are a number of helpful FAQs on our webpage that will hopefully answer many of your questions. As well as the process Dave Stubbs and Laura Meakin have described, we are also working on other activities. We are considering how the business switching process and journey interacts with the existing number porting process and where enhancements can be made. The Industry Number Porting Group have been engaged to discuss potential changes that complement GPLB. TOTSCO and the MAP community have been engaged to support the business switching solution, building on existing residential capability. At present, details around business pricing have not been confirmed. We are working to understand how emergency restoration may be achieved. We are also considering exceptions which may occur around the process and how these can be treated. We are also looking at a process for customers moving from residential to business or business to residential. The GPLB SG hopes this first high-level overview session has helped in understanding the new Ofcom regulations and the new industry-developed process that we've put in place. Further details are available on the GPLB switching webpage. You will find the new GPLB switching process, the business switching scenario matrix, business switching principles, business switching comms, and FAQs. Best practice guides are being developed and will be available at a later date. If you have any additional questions after reviewing the available information, please send them to gplb@fcs.org.uk. Thank you for listening.